Reactive training systems.
I'd love to hear your thoughts, Andrew, because I know that you've used wave loading before. Seems to be bench. It seems to be that's the lift, whether that's the least fatiguing or what, that seems to be the lift that does not respond to it pretty consistently. Or if we are starting with something, we're doing like an intro in static RPE through the whole block.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I feel like bench is one of those funny lifts. The group of people that I lift with all the time it's these blueprint strength coaches. They're really involved in the USAPL, and I would consider them very like on the trendy side. I love them, but the trendy side very much the like, what is modern powerlifting programming? And they've actually all, I don't know if you guys know Darath. Darath was actually one of Kenny's clients, and before I ever knew him, it felt like he was kind of infiltrating the static RPE into these guys' models and on the blueprint strength team. And I've seen this trend, especially from what I've talked to them about, of them being like, yeah, we actually have moved away from a lot of dynamic RPE on specifically bench. Like they still use it for squat and deadlift, like the vast majority of the time. But specifically for bench, they're like, hey, our athlete does not respond unless they have something in there that's really high intensity. And they might just make it look different. They might have some parts of it be static and some parts of it be this dynamic approach. But overall, like they do still use a lot of static RPE. And I feel like that's also been a trend that I've observed in other coaches in the last like year or so, of this static RPE kind of slowly worming its way back into like modern powerlifting programming.
Can I pontificate on this a little bit? So my theory here is that, it's the differences between squat, bench, and deadlift that are at play. The squat is essentially like this one part movement. The concentric of the squat anyway is you just stand up, and there's not a lot of weird coordination that has to happen. The bench and the deadlift are both kind of two-part movements, right? On the bench, you have like this initial drive phase off your chest where the bar tracks back toward the shoulders. Then there's this transition point, and then you press in more or less a straight line as you lock out. At least a heavy bench looks like that. The straight line benches are lighter submaximal benches, right? The deadlift is also a two-part movement, where you have like this initial drive phase off the floor that's mostly driven by knee extension and very little change to your back angle. And then once the bar passes usually around the knee, then it becomes more of like this pure hip hinge type of movement. At least the conventional deadlift is like that. Sumo is like that too, but especially people who are really leverage advantage for sumo, it blurs the line a little bit and it can look a little more one part movement like. But for most of us normies, you have a two part movement for deadlifts. The thing is, the two part movement for deadlift and bench, there's more variation in the deadlift, right? So pretty much everybody that starts out with the bench is weak off the chest, and then you bench a lot for years. And like even when we think about like an intermediate powerlifter, they've been benching for years at this point, right? Usually like 5-6 years, and you still maybe consider yourself like intermediate powerlifter, right? But the weakness off the chest starts to change and becomes more like weak around this transition point lockout. But if you're training submaximal, for one, the bar path is pretty different in the bench. And for two, you generate a lot of momentum off the bottom, but then you're just not getting full motor unit activation from the transition point on up. And we can look at bar speed data and see this as like a point of fact in training. So low RPE benches don't train a significant part of the range of motion. The same can be true about deadlift too. Like low RPE reps in the deadlift train off the floor force production, don't train so much lockout force production in deadlift. The thing is, for a lot of people, that's still good enough, for progression in deadlift. If you've got somebody who really struggles to lock out deadlifts, who's weak at the top, think about like conventional deadlifters who can, maybe they deadlift with a round back style, they power it off the floor, they struggle to lock it out, right? Those people, in my experience at least, outliers notwithstanding, tend to respond poorly to low RPE deadlifting because it's training something that they're already good at, and they're not getting much stimulus at the bottleneck, right? It's just that the bottleneck on the bench is kind of for everybody, and the bottleneck for the deadlift is kind of circumstantial. So, like low RPE training in general prioritizes the bottom range of motion of the lift. For pretty much all squatters, that's fine. For some deadlifters, a good portion of deadlifters, that's fine. Pretty much anybody who's an intermediate or above bencher, that's no longer really the bottleneck. And I think that's also part of the reason why you see kind of this emphasis on triceps oriented accessory work for powerlifters.
I think that's a great way to look at it from a skill and sort of organization around leverages and muscle groups. I think that makes complete sense. And I think that matches up with some observations that I've had with athletes where I've used the progressive sort of top set RPE model. There are some folks that, kind of come to mind when I think about their deadlift seeming to respond. But as far as I can tell, that seems to be a fatigue component. That seems to be that their impression of the deadlift is much higher from a fatigue cost perspective than the other two lifts. So I think that that's just more of a management of fatigue. That being said, one of the ways that I've answered that with a lifter that comes to mind is a half microcycle frequency. Go back way back in the day, Mike, you working with Mark Robb, easy week, light week, easy week, light week. Like you talked about that pretty extensively, like 10 years ago. And that's pretty much what that looks like. And that's the way that we've solved it. Heaviest deadlift happens 21 days before the meet, which would drive me bananas and most people, but works well for him. And it's a consistent, reliable model that we've used. And that helps him to be able to pull something heavy, feel confident, feel skillful, but also do some work that's a little bit lighter the next week to dissipate some of that fatigue. So I think there's other ways to solve the problem that isn't necessarily progressive, RPE models either. And you've talked about that too, Mike, that you think that possibly one of the benefits of wave loading could, in theory, just be management of the microcycle length, right?
Yeah, maybe management of the microcycle length. Something that you touched on here that I don't think we've talked about before. We talk about static RPE being one of the benefits, kind of made a little bit more clear what is it that you're responding to and kind of helping you see the signal and the noise. But always athlete response kind of trumps that. So if introducing more noise gets you a better response, then yeah, that's what you're doing, right? And the rest doesn't really matter. If the problem gets harder to tease apart, you go to the thing the athlete responds best to. I do want to just kind of move a couple pieces around here, because when we talk about like static RPE versus like a dynamic RPE progression, you've got to realize that you open up so many possibilities when you do that. And that can be really good, right? Like it can give you lots of places to go as a coach. We tend to talk about like this fairly vanilla progression where you start the block with a really low RPE and maybe the rep ranges stay the same, but the RPE progresses over the course of the block. But it doesn't have to be that, right? So one way to get around this bench problem that I just described would be to keep the RPE high, but start the block with higher reps and drop your reps down as you go. And you still get this nice increasing intensity, like you build in the load progression that seems to be so important to people. If you don't notice, like, I don't think it's that important, but I think people are easily deceived by more weight on the bar. But if that's what you want, then you build that in. But since it's all high RPE, you do avoid this kind of neglecting to train the bottleneck sort of effect that you get from training the bench at really low RPE. So like that's one thing you could do. But something you mentioned, John, like with the half frequency stuff, that kind of enters into the possibility. Some things that we used to do, like before emerging strategies even came along, which had more of like this alternating effect, like as you would work through a block. Again, let's consider a block maybe 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks, depending on how much time you've got. You may, like maybe week 1, you do a single at 8 RPE as your top set, and you do some back off work after that. But maybe week 2, you don't do a single at all. Maybe it's a moderate triple. And then maybe week 3, you come back to the single, or you can like have these very wide swings where you do a heavy triple, then you do kind of a moderate set of 5 or a set of 10, or like the possibilities really open up to you. And I think that's kind of, I wouldn't say like the next thing, but it's definitely some unexplored territory for a lot of people, is having, instead of like an RPE progression, having more of like an undulating approach, like an alternating approach, where you have maybe a heavier week, maybe a lighter week. And I think especially for people, like one of the hypotheses we have around RPE progressions and why they've become so popular has to do with fatigue management, and people using this as a tool to manage fatigue due to reduced work capacities or something along those lines. Well, if that's the problem, then kind of alternating these weeks is another possibility for you and can potentially increase your exposure to the thing you're responding best to. So whatever that may be, it could be, a heavy set of 5 just really makes you strong. Well, if you can't handle that every week, can you handle it every other week? Once every 14 days, really, like one hard set of 5 is going to make you so fatigued that, you can't recover in 14 days. That sounds like a stretch to me. So I think it's worth exploring for people that are in that boat.
Hey, let me tell you something that I know about you. Your lifting is important to you. It's probably one of your biggest priorities. And for people like us, nothing compares to the feeling that you get when you set a new PR. That feeling of being the best that you've ever been, of doing something that you've never done before. This is what we're all after, and it's also what RTS specializes in. Getting you the absolute best program possible so that you can hit new PRs and reach your goals. We call it radically individualized training, and we're really good at it. Whether we need to account for busy schedules or equipment limitations, or precisely turn the dials and get the details of the program just right, we have the tools and the experience to guide your lifting to the next level. To us, coaching is all about leadership, relationship, and creative problem solving. A coach should be poised to help you make tough decisions about training and competing so that you can continually grow in your development. And of course, a coach should be a first-rate problem solver, especially when it comes to your training, technique, and strategy. Now, all this has to be built off of a really strong, professional coaching relationship that emphasizes trust and respect. Additionally, RTS coaches are not on an island. We have a strong network of professionals to reach out to, so if you find yourself in need of some specific expertise, say in the realm of nutrition or injury management or sports psychology, there's a deep expertise available there too. For more information, go to store.reactivetrainingsystems.com and click on coaching. That's store.reactivetrainingsystems.com, then click on coaching. Hope to see you on the team soon.